Good afternoon, all. It is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Joel B. Pollak. Pollak is senior editor and in-house counsel at Breitbart News, where he focuses on national politics, the media, Israel, and Jewish issues. Born in South Africa and raised in Skokie, Illinois, he is an Orthodox Jew who grew up liberal, but experienced a slow awakening to conservatism as a young adult. Before joining Breitbart in 2011, Pollak received a BA from Harvard, a master's degree in Jewish studies from the University of Cape Town in South Africa, and a JD from Harvard. He has become one of Breitbart's most prolific writers, contributing a weekly column, Blue State Blues, as well as multiple news and opinions pieces daily. He is also the author of many books, including How Trump Won, The Inside Story of a Revolution, Red November, and most recently, The Agenda, What Trump Should Do in His First 100 Days. Pollak and his wife, Julia, have founded the Rhoda Kadalie Endowed Scholarship at Hillsdale College in honor of his mother-in-law, and he will be speaking about her incredible story and legacy today. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Joel B. Pollak.
Thank you all for being here, and thank you very much for the opportunity to address Hillsdale College on the occasion of the first award of the Rhoda Kadalie Journalism Scholarship. My wife, Julia, and I wanted to create a legacy for Rhoda, who passed away just 2.5 years ago, that would reflect her values, which were a fierce commitment to the truth and intolerance of any form of bigotry and a deep love of her Christian faith. Julia would be with me here today, but she is 37 weeks pregnant with our fourth child, so she sends regards and congratulations to the first recipient, Catherine Maxwell. Rhoda Kadalie was born on September 22nd, 1953 in Cape Town, South Africa, the third child of Pastor Fenner and Joan Kadalie. Fenner's father was the great African trade unionist Clements Kadalie, who started the first mass movement against racial discrimination in South Africa in the 1920s, at a time when the African National Congress, which eventually ended apartheid, was still largely an elite institution. Clements Kadalie rejected communism on the one hand and black nationalism on the other. Though his son, Pastor Fenner Kadalie, one of several children of Clements Kadalie, became estranged from his father, he inherited his father's zeal for ministering to the poor, and he did so for his entire ministry in Cape Town. Rhoda grew up in Cape Town's infamous District 6, a diverse, working-class, and somewhat rough neighborhood that was later destroyed by the apartheid government as it enforced racial residential segregation laws. Rhoda's family had moved to the quote-unquote white suburb of Mowbray, but was eventually forcibly removed from their home by the government. She was a direct victim of apartheid. Rhoda attended the University of the Western Cape, which was restricted at the time to mixed race or colored, in local parlance, students. She studied library science and anthropology and continued her studies at the graduate level, eventually joining the faculty as a lecturer in anthropology. In the mid-1980s, Rhoda received a scholarship to attend the Institute of Social Studies at The Hague in the Netherlands, which at the time attracted leading political activists from around the post-colonial world, and especially women. It was there, while achieving her master's degree in development studies, that Rhoda honed a rigorous approach to teaching and research. She also became aware of the poor treatment of women within so-called liberation struggles. When she returned to South Africa, she began challenging not only racial inequality under apartheid, but also gender inequality within the anti-apartheid movement, and the academy as well. She was among the leading anti-apartheid feminists. When democracy arrived in 1994, newly elected President Nelson Mandela appointed Rhoda to the Human Rights Commission, a constitutional office established to monitor South Africa's compliance with its new ideals. For several years, Rhoda was the leading public face of the Human Rights Commission until she resigned in protest at the ruling party's attempts to ignore the Commission's work. She continued her work in the nonprofit sector, awarding grants to development projects. She also continued her criticisms of the new government and became one of the country's leading opinion columnists. By day, Rhoda was helping the new government achieve its goals for human rights and development. By night, she was the new government's most feared critic. She rejected political correctness and became one of the country's leading opposition voices. Her credentials meant she could not be ignored nor dismissed as racist. Rhoda had been a critic of the United States at times, particularly of the George W. Bush administration, from afar. But when Donald Trump emerged, she championed his candidacy, seeing in him a kindred spirit, a plain speaker who could sweep aside political complacency. She shocked her peers by predicting that Trump would win the 2016 election. I should add that she shocked me as well, since I did not think he could win, but she was right. She continued to support Trump after she moved to the United States in 2018 to be with our family. Never a smoker, Rhoda unfortunately passed away from lung cancer in April 2022. My wife and I have never donated any significant amount of money to a university before. We are both graduates of Harvard College, so that might have seemed like a more obvious choice. But we have both become increasingly disturbed by Harvard's shift toward the radical left, which caused severe damage to student life and academic discourse. The radical, anti-Israel, and frankly anti-Semitic protests that exploded at Harvard since October 7th were a long time coming. For example, when the Black Lives Matter movement emerged after 2014, a turning point in race relations in this country, Harvard's then president, Civil War historian Drew Faust, said that the university would study the supposed legacy of slavery at the institution. Anyone who knows Harvard's history knows that it was a hotbed of abolitionism, that the privileged young men of Harvard flocked to join the Union Army and died honorably in the cause of freedom. In another instance, Harvard's administration took aim at the elite system of private, mostly all-male social clubs off campus called final clubs. Harvard could not forbid students to join because of the First Amendment, so it decided to deny university recommendations for anyone participating in same-sex clubs of any kind. This had the unintended effect of threatening clubs and activities started by women, for women. By adopting a posture of radical egalitarianism at odds with its own elite status, Harvard hurt the students it was trying to help. We came to know Hillsdale through conservative media. I am an editor at Breitbart News and was a fan of Rush Limbaugh, who often promoted Hillsdale on his radio show. When we moved to a new home in Los Angeles, we received a mailing from Hillsdale intended for the previous owner. We sent back a small donation, I think it was $25 or something like that, and we began receiving Imprimis, the Hillsdale newsletter. Rhoda became an avid reader of the publication. Thus began our close relationship with the college. I visited Hillsdale shortly before Rhoda passed away. I wanted to discuss ways that Hillsdale could become more attractive to Jewish students. In my view, too many Jewish American students spend their lives in left-wing educational institutions where the story of America is taught as part of a long history of oppression. In truth, we Jews are at the core of the American story. America's values are also our values, and I would like us to be more comfortable claiming them as such. I was impressed on that visit by many things I saw at Hillsdale. I learned that Hillsdale was the first college in Michigan from which women had graduated. I learned that Hillsdale admitted black students well before the Civil War. I spoke to deans who explained the benefit of same-sex dormitories and who took an interest in the spiritual growth of their students, not just their academic work. I admired the new church and the true spirit of liberal inquiry in the best sense in the classroom. Hillsdale rejects the idea of classifying students by race. It made that choice decades ago at the cost of losing its federal funding. To me, this evokes Rhoda's own values. A black woman, she resigned from the boards of 2 universities because they were excluding applicants for faculty positions for being white and male. That is how fervently she opposed racism of any kind. Moreover, Hillsdale remains a Christian institution, even as it works to attract more Jewish students. It does not align with any particular denomination, nor does it demand that its students profess a particular creed, but it builds its scientific inquiry on a foundation of Judeo-Christian values. Hillsdale does not tell students what to believe, but it does tell them that faith is important. That is what Rhoda believed as well, even if she was often reluctant to speak openly about her deep Christian faith. It made Hillsdale a natural fit for a scholarship honoring her legacy. I only came to know the true extent of Rhoda's faith when I began working on her biography. After she was diagnosed with cancer in September 2021, a terminal diagnosis, we knew, she and I agreed to use the time she had left to write her story. I met with her every afternoon and wrote several pages every day. She gave me a list of people to contact, and she opened her files to me, papers she had written, letters she had received, even her personal diaries. I was able to present her with a rough draft by the end of October 2021. By December, Rhoda returned it to me, full of additions and corrections. I then traveled to South Africa to interview her friends and colleagues, few of whom knew her condition. I went through archives of material that described her role in the tumultuous process of democratic change in her country. But the most remarkable discoveries only happened after Rhoda passed away on April 16, 2022. As my wife cleared out Rhoda's apartment down the street from our house, we discovered even more files and papers. These had belonged to Rhoda's mother, who had passed away just a few years before. In those archives, I found letters that Rhoda had written home from Europe in which she talked about relying on God. I found Bibles that Rhoda had used in which she had made notes in the margins. I found the notes from a Christian Bible study group she had attended as an undergraduate student. As I studied these new sources, I suddenly understood Rhoda's political journey in a new way. Rhoda had begun her political life on the left, so much so that she identified herself as a Marxist. At the end of her political life, she was on the right. Though she hesitated to use the word conservative, she was certainly a fellow traveler. I saw this as a parallel to my own journey from left to right, a natural process of maturity, perhaps, of being exposed to painful realities. For Rhoda, it was so much deeper. I began to understand that Rhoda's Christian faith was the roadmap to her political journey. When she was confronted with the injustice of apartheid, she found the answers in her Bible, which insists on the equality of each individual in the eyes of God and does not, despite some misinterpretations, endorse any idea of race or racial superiority. It was through Bible study that Rhoda developed her political consciousness. True, she had already grown up in a religious home, one in which Pastor Kadalie would routinely test his children at dinner, making them recite verses or list the books of the Old and New Testaments, both forward and backward. But she rebelled against a simplistic Christianity that she felt was uncertain about the role of women and that struggled to find an answer to apartheid. She rediscovered her faith through her Bible study with her peers at college, many of whom faced the same questions she was asking herself. If Rhoda's renewed Christian faith motivated her to join the anti-apartheid movement, it also gave her the moral courage to stand up to the new post-apartheid government. She stood up for Israel as well against her colleagues on the left. Rhoda drew upon a deep sense of right and wrong and an almost prophetic sense of intolerance toward corruption. In a revolutionary age, when old institutions were being torn down, Rhoda realized the need for traditional values. So what on the surface seemed like a profound change from left to right now appeared to me to be a deep continuity between Rhoda as a young, idealistic student of anthropology and Rhoda as a mature, battle-tested observer of the political scene. Rhoda insisted that human beings be held accountable to a set of expectations made clear in a book that anyone could read. And if she was harsh or pessimistic at times in her commentary, it was because she knew it is in our nature, as the Bible says, to fail the test. The Christian legacy of Rhoda Kadalie is the idea that the values of the Bible are the values of liberation. These values, your values, the values that Hillsdale College embraces, have always been the key to freedom. When Frederick Douglass or Martin Luther King Jr. stood up against oppression, they always called upon Americans to return to the founding values and documents of our country and the founding principles of our shared Judeo-Christian tradition. I say Judeo-Christian proudly because we Jews are an integral part of it and have been from the start, even if we have sometimes felt excluded or overlooked. To me, one of the most important founding documents of our country is President George Washington's letter to the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island, dated August 18, 1790, in which he promised not only religious liberty, but also safety for Jews. Quote, "There shall be none to make him afraid," end quote. We Jews have witnessed recent events on college campuses across the nation with alarm. There has been an explosion of anti-Semitism linked to protests against not just the Israeli government, but the existence of the State of Israel, and all in response to a war that began when radical Islamic terrorists murdered 1,200 people in Israel, most of them civilians. This is not about criticism of Israel. It is about expunging any attachment to it, physical or spiritual. Jews everywhere, left and right, have experienced this as a direct assault. At the University of California, Los Angeles, near where I live, Jewish students were barred from common areas on campus unless they denounced Zionism, the belief, inherent in the Jewish faith, that Jews have the right to self-determination in our ancient homeland. Anti-Israel students set up so-called encampments, debate-free zones whose boundaries were enforced by physical force. I reported for Breitbart on the UCLA encampment, and although I found it a hostile and hateful place, I was even assaulted at one point, I also felt a degree of sympathy for the activists, because aside from their political goals, it was clear they were also trying to build a sense of community that they did not have. In addition to their slogans, they had also advertised communal events, meditation, exercise, even prayer, at least Islamic prayer. These were things they were not getting from their university. When you look around at the campus protests, it is noteworthy how few of them are taking place at Christian institutions. That is partly because Christian colleges have not forgotten that students still need spiritual nourishment. If you do not get it from God, you seek it elsewhere. We human beings have an innate capacity for faith. It can be cultivated for good, or it can be turned toward evil, but it is always there. At other colleges, social justice, quote unquote, fills the vacuum of faith. But first, we must understand what justice is. And Hillsdale has not forgotten the classical and biblical roots of the term, nor has it forgotten that the primary purpose of a university is to seek truth before justice. Rhoda never lost sight of the moral foundations of politics, and she was deeply engaged in her Christian faith, even if she did not always advertise her convictions. In our Jewish family, she remained true to her Christian self. Her faith was not an obstacle, but a pathway to tolerance. The Christian legacy of Rhoda Kadalie is the understanding that the principles of the Bible are deeply relevant to liberty. They are revolutionary when they need to be, and they help us find our way again when change threatens to overwhelm us. How fortunate you are here at Hillsdale College to have started from those foundations and to have preserved them. By protecting and teaching and learning our shared moral principles, you are ensuring a brighter future for all of us. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions. Any and all questions, Breitbart, Rhoda, politics. Oh, I should mention, this is the biography of Rhoda. So it was originally intended to be about 200 pages. It's a little more than 600 pages, but it's very readable, or so I'm told. I think it is anyway. And then this is my new book. This is out in the last 2 weeks. This is The Agenda, What Trump Should Do in His First 100 Days. So if you have questions about that, I'm happy to answer that as well.
If you have any questions, you can come forward.
Judging by the size of your book, it looks like you enjoyed the biography more than the Trump book. Favorite story about your mother-in-law that you'd like to share with us?
You just mentioned the size of the book, so I'm going to give you an interesting story about Rhoda's husband, who I didn't mention in the speech. Rhoda was divorced, and her marriage was interesting and difficult in some ways. She married Richard Bertelsmann, who is still alive. He is a language expert, now retired. He still lives in Cape Town. And his family was from Germany originally. He was born in Namibia. And he rebelled against his parents in marrying Rhoda. First of all, their marriage was illegal under South African law at the time. Black people and white people could not marry, could not have intimate relations. And so they eloped to Namibia, where interracial marriage had been legalized, and that's where they got married. But it was a rebellion also because Richard's father had fought in the Second World War on the quote-unquote wrong side. He had been in the German army in an infantry division, and then later in the propaganda division. He worked under Joseph Goebbels at Potsdam, producing English language propaganda broadcasts designed to undermine Allied morale. And although he was not involved in any atrocities, Richard's father was a fervent believer at the time, not later in his life, but at the time in the ideology of National Socialism. And for Richard to marry a black woman was the ultimate act of rebellion, and he of course was and remains very left-wing. He is anti-nationalist in every sense, anti-religion in many senses. A very interesting guy, and they had a difficult relationship, partly because of those differences. But Richard's family over time became much more tolerant and eventually embraced Rhoda, although more so after the divorce than during the marriage. But I was curious about Richard's family, so I did some research into Richard's family as well in describing Rhoda's life. And there's a fascinating story about faith. And I think this is probably a forum that will appreciate it, so I'll tell it to you. Richard's father, that is Rhoda's father-in-law, who had been a member of the Nazi Party and had fought in the Second World War, had also spent time before the war as an exchange student in South Africa. And before the war, he was studying law, and he was an exchange student who learned English and also learned Afrikaans, which is the Dutch derivative widely spoken in South Africa, more widely than English. And he spent a year at Stellenbosch University, still one of South Africa's finest universities, and then he went back to Germany and fought in the war. He was employed at the propaganda division after serving on both the eastern and western fronts in the infantry alongside panzer divisions, and he was producing these broadcasts. But eventually, in between those two assignments, he had an uncle who was a general, part of the old Prussian military aristocracy, who wanted to get him away from the front, so he gave him a job to do, and his job was to inspect the conditions at prisoner of war camps. These were not the concentration camps of the murder of Jews. These were prisoner of war camps that were set up for other nations that obeyed the Geneva Conventions or signed the Geneva Conventions. So he was visiting British and South African prisoners of war. And he would report back to his uncle, who was the general in charge of the administration of these camps. And he went to a camp where there were a lot of South Africans. And suddenly they had someone to speak to who understood Afrikaans. And so they told him all of their grievances. They had two major grievances. One was that they had no Christian minister from their church, the Dutch Reformed Church, in the camp, so they could not have their own religious services. And the other, which is a very typically South African complaint, is that they were not allowed to play rugby. The German prison officials refused to let that many men on a sports field at one time, fearing a prison rebellion. And so they were very frustrated because rugby is very important in South African culture. And he promised to see what he could do. He went back to his uncle. He told his uncle what the complaints were, and the uncle made sure the prison conditions were improved. They were given a rugby ball and a Dutch Reformed Church minister once in a while. And the prisoners were so thankful that they wanted to give Werner Bertelsmann, this young German officer, they wanted to give him a token of their appreciation. He refused any gift. He said, "You're prisoners, you have nothing." But one of them said, "I'm going to give you my Bible." So he gave him his Afrikaans language Bible, and he signed it, J.A. Joubert, and gave the date. I think it was April 1944. And my wife's grandfather, Werner Bertelsmann, appreciated this Bible, and that would have been the end of the story. But the war ended, And the Americans who took over that part of Germany rounded up all the German officers who had been suspected of being involved in atrocities, and they imprisoned them. Bertelsmann was not rounded up because he was a translator, and the Americans found him very useful because of his law degree. When they set up the Nuremberg trials, he worked for the defense. He was then employed by the Americans as a defense attorney defending accused German war criminals, and this, of course, was necessary to make sure that everyone at least had a defense. And the Americans quickly grew very frustrated with him because he was a very good defense attorney, and he managed to get many Germans acquitted, or at least the charges dropped, often because of the unusual circumstances of confessions, violations of rights, and so forth. And the American commander really resented this lawyer. And so eventually, to make a long story short, if it's not too late to do that, he eventually had Rhoda's father-in-law arrested on basically a pretext, and he was arrested and was being interrogated, and the American interrogators said to him, "You must be a member of the German Secret Service, and you are secretly a sympathizer with these accused war criminals, and the penalty for being part of the German Secret Service was exile to a prison camp." And this was terrible because Werner Bertelsmann had just been married a few days before, and he was innocent, but nothing he said could convince them. He said, "Well, listen, I'm innocent," and the Americans accused him of visiting all these prisoner of war camps. They said, "That's evidence you were in the German Secret Service. Nobody had access to these prisoner of war camps. You must have been interrogating the British and South African officials." He said, "No, my uncle sent me there, and I can prove it to you." And they said, "Ha, your uncle is no good as a witness. He is a convicted war criminal." And this did in fact happen. His uncle was convicted of the crime of leaving British prisoners deliberately in the way of an Allied bombing raid. They were working at a fuel factory, and the Allies bombed it, and he was convicted of not bringing them back into the camp. And he served, I think, 2 years in a prison in Germany before being released. But they said, "Your uncle's word is no good. He's a convicted war criminal." And he said, "Well, I was not part of the Secret Service, and I visited these camps." They said, "What proof do you have?" And he had no proof whatsoever. And then he said, "I remembered this Bible. I had this Bible, and it says a date, and the prisoners thanked me, and they wrote me a note." And the American officers laughed at him. Just then, there was a knock at the door, and a care package came in that was allowed into the prison. And Werner Bertelsmann's newlywed wife had sent a basket of fruit, and because she thought he was getting bored in jail, she included a Bible, not a German Bible, which would have been boring, but she included this Afrikaans Bible, which she knew he would be more stimulated intellectually to read. And he opened the Bible, and there it was, the letter exonerating him of this charge, and they let him go. Now, why tell a story about a German member of the Nazi Party in any kind of redemptive sense? The Bertelsmann family, who I also interviewed for this book, was very happy that I told that story. They hadn't actually seen it in print before. I had to piece it together from different sources. But it shows that there's a redemptive power of faith even for people who have done things that are wrong. I mean, this is not one of the good guys of history. And he found a redemption in literally, physically, the Bible. And Rhoda believed that as well. She gave a sermon once at Easter. She would sometimes give these lay sermons. And one of them discussed corruption in South Africa. And even though she was an anti-corruption crusader, she said that Christians had to open their hearts even to corrupt politicians and welcome them into the church because even they could repent. And she used the story of Jesus dining with a tax collector in the New Testament, who everyone else hated, and they couldn't believe Jesus was hanging out with this guy. But that was the point. That was the point that Jesus was illustrating. And Rhoda used that story to say nobody is beyond redemption and salvation. There is a path to redemption. Not every path is equal or effective. But there is something potentially redemptive in every human life. And anyway, that's a very long answer to your question, but that is actually one of my favorite stories because it does fit in with Rhoda's values.
Hey, thank you so much. I was going to ask you what Rhoda's views of the ongoing political situation in South Africa was as she got older. You know, I think a lot of the images that have come out recently of riots and violence, social decay, there is a real question about the long-term stability of the South African state, and some of these more radical elements seem to be gaining power. What was her view as to what was happening in her home country as she got older?
Rhoda was deeply pessimistic about South Africa over time. Very optimistic at first, but she became deeply pessimistic because of the reintroduction of race as a basic criterion for government. We have a version of that in this country. It was much more, and it remains much more, of a dramatic, almost extreme policy in South Africa that has resulted in the flight of skilled people, both white and black, from South Africa, and has resulted in the looting, basically, of the state. Everywhere outside of Cape Town, which is governed by the opposition, is basically dysfunctional in South Africa. And unfortunately, in the course of my research, I visited South Africa. I of course, had spent a lot of time there when I was younger, but I visited in 2022 and then in 2023, and I saw it deteriorate even in the few months between visits. Rhoda was deeply pessimistic, and she felt that the abuse of race in the new South Africa was its greatest tragedy. And the whole point of the anti-apartheid struggle was to overcome race. And to have it reintroduced as a criterion was so corrosive. And it was basically used and exploited as an excuse by members of the ruling party who were not, in many cases, poor or underprivileged, but who had close access to power, and some of whom had become very wealthy and who continued to benefit from preferential treatment in contracts and state tenders and things like that. And she felt that was the great tragedy of South Africa. But she never really gave up hope, and she did advocate for change, and she continued to believe that there was a possibility of renewal, but she was very pessimistic. I do think that, even though she died before the most recent South African election, I think she would have been both hopeful and pessimistic at the recent election results. What happened in the recent election was the ruling party, which she came to detest after a while, was forced below 50% for the first time. It dropped below a majority for the first time since 1994. Theoretically, the opposition could have put together a coalition to take over completely. And the Democratic Alliance, which was the leading opposition party, which she supported, could have assembled a coalition. That's how the Democratic Alliance took over Cape Town in 2006 in the municipal elections. I was involved in that when I was living there. And they assembled a coalition of smaller opposition parties to do it. And this time they didn't do it. They decided instead to go into a coalition with the African National Congress, with the ruling party that had just lost its mandate. And I thought that was a big mistake. And I wrote a column about it saying, this is why you need a Donald Trump, because love him or hate him, Donald Trump will always try to win. He'll try to find a way to win. Maybe he pushes it a little bit too far when it comes to things like January 6th, trying to find any possible way to win, but you need someone who has that killer instinct to take advantage of the rare opportunities that present themselves. And I think Rhoda would have been disappointed that the opposition in South Africa didn't seize the opportunity to do on a national level what it had done in Cape Town on a municipal level, because the problem with coalition governments is you don't control anything ultimately, but you're blamed for everything that goes wrong. And I don't think that the new coalition government has taken any serious new direction to fix the problems in South Africa. So the opposition party will lose the benefit of being outside the government and being able to criticize. It will lose its support, likely. I mean, who knows, things could still go well for them. But I think Rhoda would have felt as I did, which is that you need leadership that can seize the opportunity. And I think here's a tragic fact that I write about in the book. She believed in America. She believed very strongly in America. And she was disappointed to see the wokeness at universities and in popular culture. She thought this was a grave mistake that South Africa had made. She did not want to see America make that mistake. And she applied for American citizenship. And she passed her test while she was being treated for cancer. And she died on April 16th. And the invitation to appear for her swearing-in ceremony came dated April 25th. So she died a week before becoming an American citizen. And I think that was tragic because she really did love this country and believe in its potential. And she loved Hillsdale. And in a way, she died a South African, which has its own sense of propriety about it. But she really believed that this country's potential for renewal was very, very strong, although she also believed the threats to that potential were very real.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. You mentioned kind of everything that's been going on college campuses and whatnot, especially over everything going on in Israel. And my question for you is, what do you think the academic landscape looks like for Jews and Muslims alike as in interacting in the classroom? Is that possible after what has happened? And is there a way to kind of heal the tear that has happened in the upper education?
So let me talk generally about Jews and Muslims. The community I grew up in, Skokie, Illinois, is still home to a very large Orthodox Jewish community. Increasingly, over the last 20 years, it has also become home to a large Muslim community. And the Jewish day school that I went to in the community, the building is now a Muslim school. And I actually visited to see the school a few years ago, and I was present at the school as a third grader when two Polish Christians who had hidden Jews during the Holocaust were invited to plant 2 trees at the entrance to the school. And I walked around the school with the new Muslim vice principal, and she showed me the facility, and the room that had once been our synagogue was now a mosque, and so forth. And some of this was difficult for me to absorb a little bit, although the school simply relocated to a different suburb. The Jewish school still exists. But I asked her if she knew what the trees were for, these 2 trees at the entrance, and she didn't know. And so I told her, I said, these trees are about these Polish Christians who protected Jews during the Holocaust. And she was very grateful to know that. And she felt that that was important to her as the principal of this Muslim school, because it meant that this was a place that valued tolerance. I have spent a lot of time in the Muslim community. I even lived with a Muslim family for 2 years when I was younger. I studied Arabic. My experience is that Jews and Muslims do get along very well. There's no inherent reason for these communities to be at odds. And even the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not a reason for these communities to be at odds with one another. In July, I traveled with a group of Christian pastors to Israel. It was the first time I'd gone to Israel with a specifically Christian group. It was a wonderful experience. But before doing that, I stopped over in Dubai. I had been in Dubai before October 7th, and I was amazed at how tolerant the United Arab Emirates was, how they had created a new synagogue and a church and a mosque next to each other in Abu Dhabi. And I was very worried that things might have deteriorated after October 7th, so I wanted to go again. And I spoke to the Jewish community of the United Arab Emirates, which is small but growing, and they told me that they felt safer in the United Arab Emirates than they did on the streets of New York or Chicago. The Emirati government has protected the Jewish community of that country, even though on an official level it has differences with Israel over its policies toward the Palestinians. So this doesn't need to be a conflict that divides Muslims and Jews. It is a conflict perpetuated by radical Islam and by billions of dollars flowing from the Islamic Republic of Iran, which unfortunately we have, through different administrations, given them access to. And it is perpetuated by other institutions that we have unfortunately funded, like the United Nations Relief and Works agencies and other groups. And it's also taken on a life of its own. What's interesting to me is the large number of gay Muslims who are extremely pro-Palestinian and anti-Israel. Now you might think, how does that work? Israel is the only society in the Middle East that tolerates gay and lesbian individuals. And I think it's because often these individuals feel marginalized within their own community, and their way of reclaiming their status within the Muslim community or asserting their status is to become the champions of the Palestinian cause. So the Palestinian cause has become a vehicle for all kinds of other phenomena, a way for first-generation American Muslims to blend their American and Muslim identities somehow. It's a way to fit within the DEI hierarchy that has taken root at some of these institutions. But look, the answer to these campus protests is not to protect Jewish students with the same raft of DEI policies that are partly responsible for creating the problem. Because what has happened is that Jews have been assigned to the subordinate role, along with other quote-unquote white people on the DEI hierarchy. Israel is seen as a colonial oppressor nation, and therefore it is to be denigrated. Even if Jews are the greatest victims of hate crimes, unfortunately, still in this country, which are very low. Still, even with a surge of anti-Semitism, we have to acknowledge America is the most philo-Semitic country in the world outside of Israel and is still a very safe place for Jews overall. But still, Jews are the most frequently targeted group. And even with that, Jews are told on college campuses that they are a privileged elite and their country is a problem and so forth. Their spiritual home is morally problematic. The answer is not to outlaw speech or to tell people that they have to go through special sensitivity training. I think people being educated about the Holocaust, about the history of Israel could help. But really what's most important is the history of the United States and the values of the United States. And what Hillsdale preserves, and I was so touched actually when President Arn sent out his Christmas card this year when he quoted from George Washington's letter to the Hebrew congregation. Because that's the essence of it. It's not just that you have religious liberty in this country. Washington explained that religious liberty doesn't come from the government. You're not here because we tolerate you. You don't have religious liberty because we're kind enough to give it to you. It's not because Christians are so generously giving this liberty to Jews, which was the context of his letter. It's because every individual has a God-given right to that liberty. And then he added the line about Jews being safe in America. That religious liberty protects Jews, it also protects Christians, and it protects Muslims. That is not taught at American universities. It is just not taught. People have no idea of the foundations of religious liberty. And so the answer is not to restrict liberty even more, although I do think colleges can be clear about what they as a collective community believe, and I think that it's good for colleges to say, we support the state of Israel, we oppose academic boycotts, you're free to protest if you like, but we support these principles and ideals, we oppose terrorism against civilians. If you want to advocate for that, you can do it on the sidewalk, but we're not going to support you with university funding. But above all, teach people what America is about. That's what's missing. And I remember watching the congressional hearings on anti-Semitism, and so few of the members of Congress even referred to this idea. So I think the answer for reconciling these differences is to dig again into the foundations of religious liberty in this country, because they apply to everybody. And in this specific case, where Jews really are a more vulnerable group, George Washington made a promise. And I think as a Jewish person and as a Jewish community, that's a promise we have to hold our government to and our academic institutions. But the other promises in that letter apply to everyone. And I hope that answers your question. I do think there is a road ahead where people can walk together. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is solvable, but it's not solvable with more money for weapons. It's not solvable for more money for extremist regimes. We have to cut off the supply of money, first of all. And then you can start a conversation about how we fix that. But it's not a roadblock to tolerance or academic discourse. One last point about this. All of these encampments, when you would go to them, as a reporter, I would go and ask students, the same thing I ask anybody in any setting, why are you here? What do you believe? What brought you here? They would all say, I can't talk to you. You have to talk to someone else above me, the media people or whatever. That's the opposite of what a university is about. A university is about discourse. If you take a position, you have to be able to defend it. You have to try to convince other people to embrace it. That's not what these encampments were about. They were about really the opposite of university discourse. And that's why they should have been removed right away. They sought to shut down discourse, not only to shut down pro-Israel investments or whatever, but they're an assault on the idea of the university itself. We have to stand up for freedom and remind people where it comes from. And Hillsdale does such a wonderful job of that. Harvard, unfortunately, does not.
Thank you so much for speaking with us today. I want to ask a bit more about your coverage of the protests on campuses, because I did some of that this summer in DC, and I found your diagnosis of why some of the protesters were there to match up with my experience. So can you say a little bit more about exactly why you went to UCLA, how that protest differed from any of the others around the country, and maybe differed from past experiences you had with this?
Well, I went to UCLA simply because it was the closest to where I live and the easiest for me to cover. It was similar to the other protests in that the activists were highly trained. They had obviously learned, whether from the internet or from training institutes, how to conduct themselves. And one of the tactics they had was to create physical boundaries. First it was wooden barricades, then it was people patrolling the perimeter. Eventually, to the great shame of UCLA, it was also the university which put up steel barricades around the encampment. They claimed later that was to prevent its expansion, but the message it sent to the rest of the university community was that UCLA was officially endorsing this encampment, which was a big problem and came up in the recent federal court case that UCLA lost. A federal court has now issued an injunction that UCLA has to make sure this kind of thing never happens again. But these students were trained in how to exclude other people from their encampment, and I was the victim of this. I mentioned I had been assaulted. I went to the UCLA encampment, and there was a sign that said media entrance, and I had my press credentials, and so I went there, and I said, I'm from the media, I'd like to come in and film, which is all I wanted to do. I wanted just to film it for a video, and they said, well, we're not letting anyone in right now. And I said, well, I just want to look around. And the person guarding the media entrance was a little bit nervous, and she said to me, okay, but you have to wear this mask. Now, we're outdoors. The worst days of the pandemic are behind us, but I said, okay, I'll wear a mask, so I had to wear one of those canine, whatever they're called, masks. And I start walking around and filming, and all of a sudden I get surrounded by a group of people in fluorescent jerseys who are trying to block me from filming. And eventually they all link arms, and they physically force me out of the encampment. And I'm not pushing back, I'm just letting myself be pushed by 12 or 13 people. The funny thing to me, and I kept filming the whole time, this is on video, you can see it at Breitbart.com, but the funniest part to me, I tried not to laugh, was while they're shoving me out of their encampment, one of them starts yelling, peaceful protest, peaceful protest. It's the opposite of a peaceful protest. So now I'll tell you what made that different. That was similar at other colleges. Here's what made it different, and I predicted this would happen. UCLA is in Beverly Hills, basically. In Westwood, but near Beverly Hills. Beverly Hills is one of the most Jewish areas of Los Angeles. The City Council of Beverly Hills, which has limited powers, but it does have some local authority, is probably one of the few city councils in Los Angeles governed by Republicans. And it's also very pro-Israel. They put 1,200 Israeli flags on the lawn in front of the city sign in honor of the people murdered on October 7th. And it happens to have a large number of Jewish people, and also it has a large number of Iranian immigrants, most of them Jewish. That's the only part of LA that voted for Trump, by the way, in 2020, North Beverly Hills, because of the large number of immigrants from Iran who like Trump because he stood up to Iran, to the Iranian regime. They don't like the Iranian regime, that's why they're here. I said to a friend after visiting the encampment, this is not going to end well. And I later went to, there was a pro-Israel counter-protest, and there were a few scuffles and so forth. And then there were social media videos circulating of Jewish kids getting excluded from class or not allowed to cross the campus if they were visibly Jewish, if they were wearing like a Jewish star necklace or something like that. And I said, this is not New York, this is not Northwestern University near Chicago. The people around this campus are direct victims of anti-Semitism in the countries they came from, and they are not going to tolerate this. This is actually going to end violently. And I didn't know that it would. I had no inside information. But later that night, when I made that warning, there was a group of about 100 vigilantes, some masked, some not, who showed up at the camp after a week in existence watching, and they had all seen the social media videos, and they probably had spent it was Passover, so they had probably been talking about it amongst themselves. They showed up with sticks and flagpoles, and they attacked the encampment. And they ripped down the barricades, and there were fights all night long. And finally, after a week, UCLA called in the California Highway Patrol and the Los Angeles Police Department, and the next day they disbanded the encampment. And that's what it took for them to do something, okay? That doesn't justify the vigilante actions, but I wrote, there's not one jury in this community that will convict anybody they arrest for doing this. There's not one, and so I think there's only been one prosecution brought, some guy dumb enough to get filmed or unlucky enough to get filmed on camera, actually fighting someone. There's not one jury that will convict because the entire community was so fed up with the inaction of the university that the entire community, if not openly supportive of violence, is at least going to tolerate this violence because they felt that the university and the local authorities were not going to protect them. Gavin Newsom said nothing, our governor. The mayor of Los Angeles said nothing. Nobody did anything to protect these Jewish kids on campus until these vigilantes showed up and did something. Now, in some ways, there's something very Jewish about that, which is that Jews are often victimized until they fight back and demonized as soon as we do. That's the story of Israel. But in other ways, it shows what happens when you don't enforce the basic rules of civilized society. If you allow people to take over universities with these encampments and shut down debate, the inevitable result is going to be violence, whether from the encampment, and there was some, I was assaulted before this whole thing happened, or against the encampment by people who've just had enough. But this is deeply corrosive to our society. We have the collapse of law and order, and we see that in our cities with everything that's happened in the last 4 years under these one-party systems run by Democrats in most of our major cities. And it has to stop. It absolutely has to stop. I used to joke that socialism is a luxury good. I would be a socialist, but I'm not wealthy enough. Liberalism is also a luxury good. Liberalism, not just left-wing liberalism, but liberal discourse, is a luxury we enjoy because we are safe. Safety is the prerequisite for free speech. And unless we can protect ourselves from intimidation and violence and so forth, we cannot have a discourse. These encampments physically prohibited speech on campus and violated religious liberty. And we cannot enjoy liberty as a country unless we are safe. And part of the appeal, I think, of many voters, in spite of January 6th and everything like that, part of the appeal of Donald Trump is people felt safer with Trump. And they are willing to go with a candidate who is a little bit erratic because they feel safer. That's good on the one hand, but on the other, why does it take a candidate like that to restore safety? Where are the Americans, Democrats as well, who are willing to stand up for what's right? And it has to be Democrats as well because Republicans are not going to govern these areas. So where are the people standing up for this?
I think that's all we have for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. Sure, yeah.
I've always been puzzled why so many Jews are liberal and Democrats versus conservative. Is it because they feel they were oppressed and therefore they support oppressed people, or exactly why is that?
That's a great question. It's one many Jewish people have trouble answering. Your answer is part of the answer. The part of it that I try to address is, like black voters, Jewish voters have a political identity in this country that is shaped by a sense of persecution that has a basis to it. And unfortunately, it is very easy to convince Jewish voters to stay within one party. I think any ethnic group exerts more authority if it's a swing vote, right? Because if they have to compete for your votes in every election, you have much more power. But it's easier to frighten Jewish voters into staying within the Democratic fold by telling them that the Republican side represents anti-Semitism and this new buzzword, Christian nationalism. And there is unfortunately a fear of both religious Christianity and of nationalism within the Jewish community that partly comes from our history, but also comes from a lack of contact with and understanding of religious Christians. There is an ignorance within our own community, and I'm not trying to disparage my community or blame anybody for it, but as much as we have, I think correctly, asked the rest of the country to understand us and our experience, and I think most do. This is, again, the most philo-Semitic country in the world outside of Israel. I think we also have to educate ourselves. And when I was in Israel with these Christian pastors, my eyes were opened to a dimension of Israel I had never known before, and I would not have known had I not been traveling with these pastors. They have a deep love for the for the state of Israel and for the Jewish people. It's something that I don't think Jews realize. And I think people have a fear that the ultimate political aim of Christian conservatives is to convert Jews away from the Jewish faith. And this, ironically, is a fear held most fervently by less religious Jews. In other words, the more observant you are, the less you fear it because you're confident in your own faith. And that's why you often see religious Jews voting conservative. They're less caught up in this fear. But I do think we have to educate ourselves a little bit more and reach out to Christians and build those bridges. And I was so grateful for everything I learned, and I continue to learn. Just a way of telling this story, I went to the Sea of Galilee, which is absolutely beautiful. But when you're Jewish and you grow up learning about the Sea of Galilee, what you learn about it is that it is Israel's most important source of fresh water. It's a fun place to go fishing or water skiing, and that's what you learn about it. It doesn't play a huge role in the Old Testament. When you read the New Testament, the Sea of Galilee is center stage for almost everything important that happens until the crucifixion. And to travel the Sea of Galilee and the region of Galilee with Christians who know their Bible, it's like experiencing a completely different landscape. And it's so fascinating. It's so fascinating. And there's a new hotel that just opened there called the Magdala Hotel, where it's run by the Catholic Church, but as part of the construction of the hotel, they had to excavate to find any antiquities. They uncovered a first-century synagogue that existed at the time of the Second Temple in Jerusalem and in which Jesus probably preached. So it's of interest to both Christians and Jews. And these are the kinds of commonalities that are there. So unfortunately, there's some work that those of us on the conservative side of the spectrum have to do within our own Jewish community, I think, to remind Jews that American Christians have been our greatest friends, not just Israel's greatest friends, but have been the greatest friends of the Jewish people. And in this book, if I can plug my other book, one of my suggestions is that the date of Washington's letter to the Hebrew congregation at Newport, August 18th, 1790, be commemorated by Americans. We don't necessarily need another public holiday, we have plenty of those, but at least some public observance of a day to honor religious liberty and its roots. And I think if more Jews understood the deep connection that this country's formative Christianity has with the Jewish faith, I think people would feel more comfortable voting according to the issues and the candidates and not according to their fears. All right. Thank you so much.